Okay, so in this short presentation, I'm going to discuss misconceptions of evolutionary theory. This is to supplement the other materials for week 2. Okay, so the first misconception I'll be discussing is this idea that natural selection means that things are progressing. One of the common ideas about natural selection that people tend to have, and even sometimes comes through in some of the more scholarly materials, is this idea that evolution means things are getting better. If you do end up taking my cultural anthropology class, we spend quite a bit of time talking about this idea of progress and why it's problematic. I noticed that even in the BBC documentary that I had you watch this week, the narrator comes close to talking about this idea that natural selection, makes things work better than they did before. He talks about complexity, and he uses the example of eyes and the evolution of eyes, and he's trying to show how something can change over time in such a way that it becomes almost unrecognizable that it was connected to that previous thing. But using words like complexity make us think of something as better, typically. But what complex actually means is simply that there's more components than previously involved. There's a few reasons why we have to be careful about this idea of progress, and specifically why it doesn't work in terms of talking about natural selection. First, progress is always skewed by the perspective of the observer. So if we want to talk about is species making progress through evolution, we'd have to think about how we would measure that. For plants, maybe photosynthetic ability would be a marker of progress. If that changes, if that somehow improves, we might say that that species progressed. But if you were a different type of organism, if you were a spider, for example, then perhaps the efficacy of your venom delivery system would really be what you were looking at or interested in terms of measuring some kind of progress. And of course, for humans, we try to measure cognitive ability and use that as a measurement in terms of progress. Or we might think that was important to do that, and we do tend to do that in at least Western culture. And we know how complicated it is to try to make measurements about cognition, human cognition. So those are some reasons why this is a misconception about natural selection. An additional reason that adds to that is that people tend to think that natural selection produces organisms that are perfect for their environment, that the whole point of natural selection is to make things better in relation to their environment, and so an organism will ultimately evolve into a creature that is a perfect match, perfectly suited for the environment that they're in. But this doesn't work for a number of reasons with evolutionary theory. Whenever traits are passed on through natural selection, there's a variety of traits that are being passed on. It's not just one trait that gets passed on through genes. And we see a lot of organisms surviving that are good enough to survive. They're not necessarily the greatest. They don't necessarily have the absolute greatest features, but they are able to pass on their genes, and that allows their genes to continue going, to continue to be passed on for a variety of reasons. We also have to keep in mind that natural selection isn't the only evolutionary process that occurs. Mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, all of these things contribute as well to an organism's genes and what they do in the world. And some of these can be harmful. So in some ways, natural selection does have a bias towards suitability with the environment, but natural selection isn't the only process that is occurring that affects evolution in genes. And some of those other types of processes can be negative, even detrimental to a species. For example, we can see high rates of certain illnesses among specific populations. There's a high rate of Hodgkin's disease among Afrikaners population in South Africa, as one example. Also have high rates of sickle cell anemia among African American populations in the United States. So you have examples where you can see that certain types of mutations or certain types of processes don't necessarily produce the greatest outcomes for a population. Yeah, so those are the main things about environment and misconceptions about how natural selection works. And these can kind of stem from a few of the other, what leads us to start talking about natural selection in these ways can stem from the following misconceptions that I'll be talking about now. So misconception number 3, this idea that the strongest, healthiest, fastest, and or smartest survive. So we've all heard this idea of survival of the fittest. But the word fittest being used in this context related to evolutionary theory is not the way that we use it in everyday conversation. So we think of the word fit as being healthy and strong, but the way Darwin was using it was to talk about those organisms within a population who had the greatest ability to pass on their genes. And those are the ones that are the fittest. You don't have to be the strongest, healthiest, fastest, or smartest in many circumstances in order to pass on your genes. So we tend to make this assumption, we see it all throughout popular culture as well, this idea that when things happen, they're the result of a natural process in which the strongest are meant to survive. And that's very problematic, and we've seen it used in problematic ways in the past with ideas like social Darwinism and so on. Darwin never intended for his ideas to be portrayed in such a way. It's not about certain people with certain strongest or best characteristics being able to continue in the human species or any species necessarily. Okay, so misconception number 4, that natural selection involves organisms trying to adapt. So somehow, sometimes we have this idea that an organism is in need of adapting and actually trying to adapt, and natural selection is part of that process. I suppose as thinking human beings, we might come up with this idea because of our very large brains, but that's not how it works in biology. So natural selection is a process that has no being behind it. It does not happen with intention. Actually, Darwin himself at some point later in his life said that he regretted using the term selection because it made it appear as though someone or some being was doing the selecting, and somehow there was like a big hand behind it. But that's not what he saw happening in the world. Natural selection is a natural process that in some ways is almost random because you have genetic variation, which is random, coming into a population, and then just those who happen to have genes that contribute to them or enable them passing along more of their genes by virtue of just something as simple as that, more and more of those genetic traits become part of the population. So he could see that happening with his finches, that those who had beaks in such a way that helped them to, or enabled them to eat more of the food available to them in their environment, were able to pass on more of those genes. So then you would see more finches in that specific environment with that style of beak. And over time, you would start to see significant changes between the different finches in the area. So that's what he was looking at. There was no attempt by these finches of Darwin's to try to change. Very similarly, there's a misconception that natural selection gives organisms what they need, so that there is, again, this idea that there's somehow a force behind it pushing it in a certain direction. So, again, we just have to emphasize here that there's nothing involved in natural selection that involves intent or wants. Biology and genes do not know what people want or what an organism needs. So it happens on a much more subtle kind of basis. All right, so misconception number 6 is that evolutionary theory, or evolution is a theory about origins. I have to wonder if this has to do with the title, On the Origins of Species, of Darwin's book that everybody has probably heard at some point, whether you remember or not. And then, of course, having to do with debates related to debates, at least in the U.S., regarding evolutionary theory and the origins of humans. And let's see. Yeah, it's a misconception because evolution was never a theory about origins per se. Darwin's, if you think about that title, On the Origins of Species, he's trying to explain why there are different species, how that comes to be, different species that are connected somehow through their history, biological history, in the past, but appear different today, and different to such a degree that they can't even reproduce together anymore, right? So that's what he's trying to explain. It's not an origins of all human life or all life in general. He's trying to explain origins of different species, how a new species comes to be in the world. Of course, there's a small segment of scientists who are looking at questions of origins and the origins of life and so on. In many ways, that's perhaps one of the greatest mysteries. But the majority of scientists who work in evolutionary theory are asking different types of questions. They're not concerned, like Darwin, with how life began. They're concerned about processes since life has begun, and processes of change over time. So that is a little bit about evolutionary theory that I hope when you hear these kinds of misconceptions in popular culture, it'll help you to remember, oh yeah, I learned about that, and I learned that it's not exactly what Darwin was saying or how evolutionary theory works.